Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. The Whitlam dismissal didn't happen in a political vacuum. It was spurred by the enthralling political scandal known as the Loans Affair. The Whitlam government had grand plans for infrastructure and development for which it needed to borrow funds. In particular, the Minister for Minerals and Energy, Rex Connor, had wanted to develop Australia's energy future with natural gas pipelines, uranium mining and enrichment plants, the electrification of heavy rail, and the development of the Northwest Shelf. But these ambitions required money, lots of it. On the fateful day of the 11th of November, 1974, Connor met with Tirath Khemlani, who promised him access to oil-rich Middle Eastern lenders who would lend at a better rate than the money markets. Khemlani was provided with a letter stating that Australia was seeking a loan of $4 billion. However, governments can't just borrow money on the basis of a letter given by a minister to a dubious Middle Eastern middleman. The established system of borrowing was much more complex. The Commonwealth Constitution had been amended in 1929 with the insertion of Section 105A. It authorised the Commonwealth to enter into financial agreements with the states concerning public debts. This included the borrowing of money by the states or the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Parliament was given the power to make laws validating such agreements and carrying them out. Remarkably, Section 105A also says that every such agreement shall be binding upon the Commonwealth and the states that are parties to it, quote, notwithstanding anything contained in this Constitution, unquote, or the state constitutions, or indeed any law of the Commonwealth or a state. That made such financial agreements extremely powerful. The financial agreement that was entered into established the Australian Loan Council to coordinate public borrowing and prevent Australian jurisdictions from competing against each other in the money market. There was provision for the Commonwealth to take over state debts, but then to be compensated by the relevant state. This sparked the conflict that led to the dismissal of the Lang Government in 1932. As explained in my earlier series of videos on the Lang dismissal, during the Great Depression, the Lang Government decided to default on paying interest to overseas bondholders. The Commonwealth Government then took over the obligation and paid the interest, but then exercised its legislative powers under Section 105A to recoup the money from the state. During this legal tussle, the Lang Government issued an instruction to state public servants about handling state revenue, which was in conflict with one of those Commonwealth enforcement laws. This resulted in the Governor, Sir Philip Game, dismissing the Lang Government for persisting in illegality. In 1975, it was another aspect of the financial agreement that came into play. All government borrowing, apart from borrowing for the purposes of defence and for temporary purposes, had to be approved by the Loan Council. The Commonwealth Government proposed to raise this extremely large amount of money from unorthodox sources. To prevent any scrutiny of this, it also sought to avoid the need for approval by the Loan Council. To do this, it needed the Governor-General to approve an Executive Council minute which stated that the loan was for temporary purposes, so there was no need for Loan Council approval. But the loan was clearly not for temporary purposes. The $4 billion loan was to be used for long-term infrastructure projects to develop Australia's natural resources. The amount, in anyone's terms, was massive. If the loan had been made, it would have tripled the country's overseas debt. To add to the dodginess of the affair, ministers decided to hold an emergency Executive Council meeting on the evening of the 13th of December 1974 in Canberra, when they knew that the Governor-General was in Sydney attending a performance at the Sydney Opera House. It was proposed that he would then rubber stamp the paperwork later, accepting this claim about temporary purposes, hopefully without asking any questions. The Executive Council is the formal body, comprised of ministers, which advises the Governor-General to exercise particular powers, such as making regulations or compulsorily acquiring property or making certain appointments. And in this case, approving the borrowing of funds. Ordinarily, Executive Council meetings are chaired by the Governor-General and 2 ministers are rostered on to attend, representing the government in advising the Governor-General. Here's a photo of the room in Government House, Yarralumla, where these meetings occur, with the current Governor-General and her official secretary sitting in their places. Formal minutes, signed by the relevant minister, are presented to the Governor-General, who then approves them by signing them, having accepted the ministerial advice. But the Governor-General is entitled to ask questions, raise concerns and seek legal advice if something looks a bit fishy, because the Governor-General, like everyone else, is obliged to act lawfully. The Governor-General therefore acts as a crucial check to support propriety and legality. In my experience working previously with the New South Wales Cabinet Office, the extra scrutiny from the Governor's Office was really helpful because it did pick up errors and prevent unlawful actions. The government was always responsive to concerns raised by the Governor's Office, and it fixed problems that were identified. Executive Council meetings are scheduled on a regular basis, but if an urgent one is required and the Governor-General is not available, the Governor-General can approve a meeting being held in his or her absence, with the Governor-General later dealing with the minutes as paperwork. This removes, however, the Governor-General's opportunity on the spot with the ministers to ask questions, raise concerns and seek further advice. In this case, 4 ministers met as the Executive Council without letting the Governor-General know that a meeting was being held. They were the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, the Attorney-General, Lionel Murphy, the Treasurer, Jim Cairns, and the Minister for Minerals and Energy, Rex Connor. They approved an authorisation for Connor to borrow money that was to be used for these long-term energy projects. Murphy gave oral advice that this could be classed as being for temporary purposes because the aim was to meet immediate economic problems. This was despite the fact that these long-term infrastructure projects would not commence for quite some time, and the loan was one for 20 years. The Attorney-General's Department did not support Murphy's view, and the Solicitor-General, Maurice Byers, thought at best it was arguable. Kerr was shocked to find out the next morning that an Executive Council meeting had been held without his approval. He examined the minute and concluded that the Attorney-General's legal advice was probably wrong. The explanatory memorandum accompanying the minute said this, quote, "The Australian Government needs access to substantial sums of non-equity capital from abroad for temporary purposes, amongst other things to deal with the exigencies arising out of the current world situation and the international energy crisis, to strengthen Australia's external financial position, to provide protection for Australia in regard to supplies of minerals and energy, and to deal with current and immediately foreseeable unemployment in Australia," unquote. Now, all of that was quite nebulous and did not explain what the $4 billion loan would actually be spent on. It was not intended to fund unemployment benefits or to buy oil, but rather to develop Australia's long-term energy production over decades. The financial agreement did not define what was meant by temporary purposes, but the Treasury practice had been to treat this as covering loans that were repayable within 12 months, not 20 years. Kerr then contacted the Solicitor-General, who repeated his view that the advice was arguable, which was far from support for its correctness. While Kerr was unhappy with the advice, he signed the Executive Council minute, reasoning that the courts would address any legal error if it was raised before them. Kerr later reported to the Queen in detail about what had occurred, including how he had not been notified of the meeting in advance and the dubious nature of the legal advice. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, responded that the story of the Executive Council meeting was, quote, "one of the most amazing I've ever heard," unquote. After Khemlani failed to produce the money, the loan authorisation was revoked by an Executive Council meeting on the 7th of January 1975, which Kerr did attend. It was followed on the 28th of January with another Executive Council meeting that reinstated the loan authority, but for half the amount, $2 billion US. When Kerr raised the same concern about whether it was a temporary loan, Murphy gave the same opinion, that it was for temporary purposes. The advice again was given orally with nothing in writing. No money was ever lent under this approval, and Connor's authority to seek the loan was revoked on the 20th of May 1975. But Connor, unbeknown to the government, including the Prime Minister, persisted in his contact with Khemlani, continuing to seek a loan, now up to $8 billion. As details of the proposed loans eventually leaked into the public, the opposition attacked the government for both its foolishness in attempting to borrow such a large amount through unorthodox and dubious means, but also for breaching the financial agreement, which has constitutional status, by not seeking the approval of the Loan Council. Public servants and the Solicitor General were summoned by the Senate in July 1975 to be questioned at the bar of the House, but they were all instructed to claim privilege and not to give substantive responses. The Senate decided not to treat them as being in contempt of Parliament because they were acting on ministerial instructions. Connor denied in Parliament that he had continued his contact with Khemlani, but Khemlani then told journalists that this was untrue. Connor again faced Parliament on the 8th of October 1975 and stated that he had only one phone conversation with Khemlani since the 20th of May, which was initiated by Khemlani around the 11th of June. Connor claimed that he told him that he could not discuss loan matters as they were now under the control of the Treasurer. Khemlani then visited Australia on the 10th of October 1975 and stated that he had had at least 20 conversations with Connor after the 20th of May about the difficulties in obtaining loans for Australia, and that he had not received any notification from Connor that his authority to negotiate loans for the Australian government had been revoked. The Herald then published a telex from Connor to Khemlani that was made after Connor's authority had been revoked and which showed that he was still seeking loans through Khemlani. This also meant that the Prime Minister had inadvertently misled Parliament by saying that all substantive communications between Connor and Khemlani had been tabled in Parliament, because this telex had not been tabled. Whitlam saw Connor on the 14th of October and persuaded him, quite forcefully, to resign. It was this revival of the Khemlani affair, the misleading of Parliament and the resignation of the minister, which was the final spark which caused the opposition to announce that it would defer the passage of supply until the Whitlam government agreed to face the people in a general election. As Paul Kelly and Troy Bramston put it, quite colourfully, Connor's enforced resignation satisfied the test Fraser had required, that he would need extraordinary or reprehensible events to force an election through the Senate. Those events were now a stage and screen spectacular. It was as though the Greek gods had conspired to doom Whitlam in a performance of tragedy, farce and incompetence." Unquote. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and do join me next time when I discuss Sir John Kerr and his motivation in relation to the Whitlam dismissal. See you then. Goodbye.